So after having the Nintendo Switch 2 since launch, I want to take the time to answer the question, is the Nintendo Switch 2 worth it? Should you purchase a Switch 2? Well, to order to answer that question, first you have to start with the hardware and the pros and cons. Starting with the pros of the Switch 2, it's no secret that it has a bigger screen, better performance, higher resolution, HDR, 120 Hz. There's a lot of good things here, as well as refinements to the Joy-Con controller, as well as the Pro controller. So there is things that are here that are positive. Nintendo did add some extra things such as game chat, which, to be honest, I'd rather just use Discord. But overall, from a hardware perspective, there's a lot to like here when it comes to the Switch 2, as it does what everybody who is a fan of the Switch 1 already wanted: better performance and more of it. While some of the discourse surrounding the Switch 2 is the lack of innovation, most people only really wanted a stronger Switch, and that's what the Switch 2 brings to the table. But what about the negatives of a Switch 2? Well, we all know the discourse surrounding the $80 games and the actual price point of $450 for the system, but there are other negatives that need to be said with regards to the Switch 2. The two that come to mind, the number one is the screen itself. Now, the screen itself, it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's bad for 2025. Because the LCD display only caps out at 400 nits. So while they talk about HDR, you only really benefit the HDR is when you're using it in docked mode, not so much in handheld mode. The other issue with the LCD screen, other than the fact that it's not an OLED, is also, as reported by the guys at Digital Foundry, the response time. The response time of 30 milliseconds. It's very, very slow, especially when you're trying to run games at a higher frame rate. It leaves behind a trail, or what they would call is ghosting. Now, while I'm not one to refute what they're saying, it might be subjective to the person's sensitivity to motion, because while what they say is true, during the main screen I can see ghosting when I move through the icons of the main screen. I don't really see it in games. And I have tried side-scrolling games. I've tried Hollow Knight. I've tried Dead Cells. And I don't really notice the ghosting that they speak of. And I definitely don't really notice it in the other aforementioned titles that I've played before, such as Fast Fusion or Mario Kart. Even when I play backwards compatibility games, I don't really notice it either. So I'm not saying that they're wrong, but it could be subjected to how sensitive you are to motion, and that can have an impact on whether or not you notice it or how much of it you notice it. The other issue with the Switch 2 comes in the form of its battery life. Now, as a Steam Deck user myself, I don't have a problem with the battery, simply because I'm used to, having a 2-hour charge and then having to plug it in. So for me, I'm used to it, but I can understand for people who come from an original Switch or from a Switch OLED specifically, where they had a much better battery life. But people need to remember, with better performance comes more battery drain, whether it's higher graphics or higher frame rates, all of which leads to more drainage of the battery itself. But to answer the question at the top of this video, is the Switch 2 worth it? Should you buy a Switch 2? Well, the answer basically comes down to this. What was your situation prior to the Switch 2's launch? In my case, I didn't have a Nintendo Switch. So buying a Switch 2 makes a lot of sense for me, because I have a whole generation worth of exclusive games that I missed out on that I can not only revisit on the Switch 2, but revisit them with higher graphics settings. Whether that's Tears of the Kingdom or the Bayonetta franchise, I'm playing games in a much better version by waiting for a Switch 2. If you own a Switch 1, but not an OLED model, then I would still say it is worth getting a Switch 2, simply because you are getting a much better performance, and even in handheld mode in general, you will see the benefits when compared to a Switch 1, while simultaneously, while the Switch 1 does have a slightly longer battery life, it won't affect you as much. However, if you have an OLED Switch, and if you have an OLED Switch, chances are you play a lot in handheld mode. If this is the case, if you fall under this category, I would suggest waiting on the Switch 2, and I don't think the Switch 2 is actually worth it for you. Simply because the screen will be a significant downgrade for you in many ways, specifically when it comes to the color palette. With that being said, you might be inclined to wait. To wait for the Switch 2 eventual refresh, which will probably have an OLED screen, and dive in then, so that you go from OLED display to OLED display. Because in my case, specifically, I have a Steam Deck, but that's an LCD. And I didn't have a Switch prior to that. However, my main monitor, where I do most of my gaming, about 80% of my gaming, is an OLED display. So majority of the time, my Switch is docked. So even though it is an LCD screen, it doesn't affect me too much because I primarily play on my monitor anyways. If you owned a Switch 1, obviously it is an upgraded virtually in every way, so it makes sense for you to want to jump in. It's rather for those who have an OLED display. If you have an OLED display, but maybe you're like me and you play 80% of your gaming in docked mode, then the OLED won't matter to you that much because of that. But chances are, if you have an OLED, you do play a lot of handheld modes, and in which case you're going to want to wait. I can't tell you enough the difference between an OLED display and an LCD display. The first game that really showcased it for me is when I played Tears of the Kingdom, and I seen the difference between the two. And Tears of the Kingdom looks night and day better on my monitor versus the handheld mode, specifically because, again, as stated at the top of this video, one of the negatives of the Switch 2 is the 400 nits brightness on that screen, that screen does not accentuate HDR. Meanwhile, I'm playing on my 27-inch 4K OLED display, and the colors are popping. And I noticed it right away with Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. So a lot of it really depends on where you come from. Where are you coming from going into a Switch 2 will determine whether or not it's a worthy investment. For me, it absolutely was a worthy investment. For some, it might be better to wait. But overall, I still recommend the Switch 2 as a hardware, because at the end of the day, despite what's on the market, despite the PC handhelds, despite Xbox collaborating with Asus to make a PC handheld, the reality remains that Nintendo has some of the best games in the market space, point blank, no denying it. And when you take that and now you can play this huge catalog of games in a much better state than they've ever been, while simultaneously getting access to new titles such as Donkey Kong Bonanza and Borderlands 4, it only makes sense that, yes, the Switch 2, despite its flaws of an LCD display and a lower battery, it is definitely worthy of the investment because it is such a good piece of hardware. It feels great in your hands. It feels like a premium product. You get some of the best games in the industry. Overall, I love my time with the Switch 2, and I'm going to continue to play the Switch 2. So I recommend the Switch 2, as I think it is a premium product, and it's definitely worth the price in terms of hardware. Software is a different story, but overall, I recommend it. I would give the Switch 2 an 8 out of 10. This is Veteran Gamer, and I hope to see you guys next time.